Okay, we're going to spend a little time talking about the reforms that Charlemagne enacted in Francia in order to improve the church. Like we said before, since Clovis, Francia, the Franks were Christians. And even though they had a interesting and spurious beginning of their Christian culture, they were committed to their Christian culture. By the time Charlemagne came around, he noticed that there were several problems, though. He noticed that his clergy was poorly educated. He noticed his clergy lacked moral discipline. The clergy were almost indistinguishable in behavior from wealthy aristocrats. That was a problem. And the monastic observance was very lax. So these monasteries were not being very effective. So one of the reforms that Charlemagne proposed was to standardize the liturgy, make sure that every Christian, when they walk into their local church, was worshiping the same way, and to set standards on worship. Carolingians also promoted a sound financial basis for local churches by making tithing mandatory. The obligation to tithe was not really appreciated at the time and became a sticking point between the church and its parishioners for many, many years. Louis the Pious imposed Benedictine monasticism throughout the Frankish Empire. This is another attempt to standardize Christian faith and practice. Carolingians did not reform the church to the extent that they wanted, but they made some impressive improvements and raised the effectiveness both of local parishes and of monasteries. Now, this had another practical consequence. By raising the effectiveness of monasteries, they were able to raise the effectiveness of missions. Because the Franks in modern-day France, approximately, were Christians. Their neighbors to the east, Germania, the Germans in Germania, were pagans, were Anglo-Saxon pagans. And the Franks took it upon themselves to promote Christianity in Germania. And now that they had some stable and financially sound institutions, they were able to make a greater impact on the kingdoms around them. Two missionaries in particular, a guy named Willibrord and a guy named Winfrith, who was later known as Boniface, became Frankish missionaries to the Anglo-Saxons in Germania. They worked for the conversions of those who had remained in their German homeland rather than going to the Anglo-Saxons that were in England. England was already converting the Anglo-Saxons at that time period. But no one was addressing the Anglo-Saxons back in Germania. And they had some interesting methods as missionaries. They would establish a monastery and a bishop in a pagan territory instead of military conquest. This was not a military takeover of Germania and they were all forced to become Christians. This was a persuasion. This is missions the way we think of missions today. A good chunk of conversion in the Middle Ages was done through political conversions and military actions. This was done through missiological persuasion. And it produced one of the most fascinating documents out there, a translation of the Bible, or parts of the Bible, into Anglo-Saxon language called the Heliand. And the Heliand was not necessarily a translation of every book in the Bible or every episode in the Bible. It wasn't even technically a translation as far as we understand converting the language of, converting one language into another language. This was more of a cultural presentation of Christianity, in which the Franks, these missionaries, Willibrord and Winfrith, reinterpreted the culture of the Bible to make it more palatable to Anglo-Saxon culture. Let me give an example. We are all familiar with the story of Jesus in the garden before he was captured, and how Peter leaps to his defense and cuts off the ear of the Roman soldier, and Jesus reprimands Peter, heals the ear, and the moral of that story is Peter screwed up again. This is how we are to treat those who oppose us, with love, not with violence. Yeah, the Hellions, that's not the moral of the story. In Anglo-Saxon culture, when you look at their epics like Beowulf and some of the Icelandic family sagas, you see a cultural phenomenon known as the hero and his thanes, his henchmen, his minions. And a hero was great in battle, and the thanes, their job was to fight right alongside their hero. The proper place for a thane to die is fighting right alongside his hero. And what the Hellion did is it reinterpreted the story of Jesus and his apostles to Jesus the hero and his thanes. So when you read this passage in the Hellion, Peter, by jumping to the defense of Jesus, is almost heralded as a good Anglo-Saxon. He's right there fighting alongside his hero. And you kind of lose this, sense that Peter did something wrong. It's an affirmation of Anglo-Saxon culture and tries to demonstrate to Anglo-Saxons that Christianity and Anglo-Saxonism are consistent with one another. It's an interesting debate to talk about whether or not that's proper, or to what extent do we need to translate not just the words of Scripture from one language into the language of the people we are ministering to. To what extent do we have to interpret, to recast the greater truths of the Bible within a culture? Within a culture. So in that sense, the Hellion and Frankish Christianity was this tremendous milestone to the brand of missiology that we're more familiar with, and raises this question of appropriateness and is this effective? Even if it is effective, is it something that we should do? But the bottom line is, despite Francia becoming Christian at the behest of Clovis, their leader, they took their Christianity very seriously and sought to purify it and to become innovative in it, and in so doing made Christianity a fresh system of belief, a fresh practice during the medieval period. I think that's fascinating personally. Wish we had more time for the Hellions. That is just awesome.